So here we are inside of Houdini 20. Before we start, I'd just like to give you a quick tip, something that helped me a lot. I didn't implement it in the beginning, but I wish I did, so I'd like to share it with you. And that is to just get a piece of paper and a pen and write down all the things that are going to help you navigate through Houdini. If you don't want to do that, I have a PDF on Patreon that you can just download for $5. It's not much, and that will help you just navigate your way through and not forget certain keys. So you won't be in a situation where basically you'll be like, oh, what is that key that I need? How do I get back to this viewport? And essentially it'll just streamline your learning process. The one thing that you need to understand is you're going to need to learn the basics before you can get into the cool stuff. And unfortunately, we all had to do it, but it is really worth doing. So let's get into it and let's learn Houdini interface. The first thing you're going to be greeted with when you open Houdini for the first time is these three panels over here, where you have your main viewport over here. And this is going to be a visual representation of all the things that you create inside of your network view, which you can find in the bottom right hand corner. And just above that, you are going to find all your settings parameters inside of your parameter view, which is your top right hand corner over here. So to best explain this, we are going to jump straight in and we are going to create our first piece of geometry inside of Houdini. To do that, we can press either tab or you can right click, whichever one is easier for you. At the moment, I'm just going to click with my right mouse button and I'm just going to type geo, and that's going to give us a geometry node. So this geometry node is essentially like a folder, a placeholder, something that is used to work inside of. Everything that we are going to create is going to be inside of folders. So it doesn't matter if it's geometry or if it's a camera or if it's a light. Each one of them is going to have a folder like this, and it's going to be inside of this network view over here. So if you created a camera at this point in time, it would create a camera node. So to get into this node, what you can press is you can press I, and that is going to go in, or you can press the U, that's going to go up, for example, or you can just double click on it or press back. So that's how you get in and out of your nodes. We are going to double click on it, jump inside, and once again, either tab or right click and start to type, for example, box. And that's going to give us our first node that's going to actually represent a geometry inside of our viewport. Every time you create a new node, you are going to be given a choice of what to do with it with these flags. And to best explain that, I will just create another node. And as I did before, it's tab or right click. And we are going to select mountain. There we go, and click over here. To connect the nodes, we just click and drag, and that'll connect the nodes. But now you see that, for example, nothing is happening. And why is nothing happening? The reason why nothing is happening is because in Houdini you have to actually specify for each node that you want to view what it is actually doing. So to do that, you need to click on this eyeball over here or click on the blue flag on the right hand side. So there we have a deformation happening on top of our geometry. And now we see it because we have actually enabled the display flag over here. So just to go through what all of these flags actually do, I will just add another one. And we'll just add that in there. And once again, we are going to enable the display flag over there. And for that to work, we just need to add a few more segments to our box over here. So if we just select our box and go to our parameter view, which is essentially our settings for whichever node is selected, we can just add in there. So we can go 20, 20, and 20. And that is going to give us our deformation over here. And I'm just going to, you see when I selected this one, it gives me different settings. So if I just reduce the amplitude of that, that is going to give us our box. And to get back to what I was talking about earlier, the display flags, we go over here and we just adjust this so we know that it's working. So if we go back to our display flag over here, it's going to show us what this node is doing and everything before it. And if we click over here, it's going to show us what this node is doing and everything before it. So if we go here, for example, we've learned what the blue flag is, and that's the display flag. And over here we have bypass, for example. So when you enable the bypass one, it's going to bypass this mountain node and it's going to go straight into the bend node. So it's going to disregard it. So if we click on it, you can see that the mountain node has been disregarded and we only have a bend that is affecting our box. So if we switch that off, we go back to that. Next thing over here, we have our information node, and that is used to find errors inside of our geometry and give us information about what is actually happening inside of our node and what attributes are also applied to this node. In addition, we can also add a note. So for example, you can say this node is not working, and explain what is going on with that node. And you can leave that for someone else that's going to pick up your file, or you can leave it for yourself. If you come back to this project file in a few months, it's just a good way to explain what's going on with each node. So you need to just enable this to show it next to your node. Okay, then we can go to this freeze node, and that is essentially just like a merge down. So if you've ever worked in Photoshop, you merge layers down. So if we came over here and we detached this node, for example, and we broke our network, and you can break your network by either pressing Y, and that's going to give you these scissors, and you can just cut the network off. Or if you reconnect it, you can click on it and just shake it, and that will also disconnect the nodes. So you can see that when it was disconnected, nothing was visible because the network was disconnected. So if we wanted, for example, just to keep this node, we could say lock, and it's essentially freezes this and merges everything down. And now when we detach it, it stays there. You could even delete these and you have everything within one node. So it's essentially collapsing everything into one node. So if you just press Ctrl Z, that will undo that. And we remove this, press OK, and now it disappears because it's not connected correctly. So we can reconnect that, and now it's working correctly. Finally, we can have a template. So for example, if we want to see what our mountain was doing before, we can click on the template, and that is going to show us this node before the bend was applied to it. So essentially, if we bypass this one, now we don't see the template because it's templated exactly what we have over here. Okay, so we'll just switch that off so you can see template is on there. It just shows you essentially a ghosted view of the previous node. Okay, another good thing to know inside of your network view is that if everything gets messed up, you can press the L key, and that'll automatically try to align everything that's inside of your network view, because sometimes it can get really messy with here when you have a lot of nodes and they're all in different places. It gets crazy. You can literally just press the L key and that will try to align everything nicely. Also, if you have everything like this and you wanted to align it vertically, you can select your nodes and press A and just drag like that, or drag them down, and that will align them vertically or horizontally. So that's just selecting your node. Many different nodes. You can get an overview of what's going on inside of your network view, and that's by pressing the O button. That's just going to give you an overview of what's happening inside. So we'll switch that off for the moment. Another thing that you can do is you can also create some network boxes. So essentially you can have this by alt click, you can copy these. So you have a few different networks that are going around, and say for instance you wanted to group them, you can just come over here and you create a network box, and that way you can move them all at once. And you can have change colors over here. You can add an image into the background and just a few simple things there. But the main thing that you need to know is just that you can add a network box, you can rename it and that kind of stuff. What I'd like to show you now is that in these settings, you can adjust the parameters in a few different ways. So you can either select it and actually type something in here, or you can middle click inside and that's going to give you this ladder. So essentially you can adjust your geometry or any settings of any node in the increments of 10 or the power of 10, which you move left or right, and that will give you these adjustments in increments. So essentially you'll use this 0.1 for smaller increments, and the powers of 1, 10 and 100 if you have something large like a landscape or something. Another good thing to remember is that Houdini works in meters. So over here it is 1 meter, 2 meter, 3 meter and so on. So it's just good to know that you are actually working in increments of 1 meter. Okay, so remember, middle click, ladder, and you can adjust your settings like that. Next thing we're going to do is we are going to figure out how we can move around and select things. Okay, so the simple thing to do over here is just left click, and that allows you to tumble around anything that's inside of your scene. Middle mouse button, pretty standard, zoom in, zoom out, and middle mouse button, if you click it, you can pan around your object like that. Okay, that's looking good. Just in case you get into a position where you are not happy with it, you can always press the G key, and that is going to bring you back to your standard position. So when you open Houdini, your viewport is always going to be in this orientation. Also, what you can do is if you have something like this, you can hit spacebar F, and that is going to frame whatever is selected or in your scene. And for example, if you have two things in your scene, and we'll just drop a merge in here one more time. So now we have two things in our scene and we want to center everything that is in our scene. We can just press spacebar and H. And that is going to bring us back to our home view, but it's got both things inside of our viewport. Okay, so we've learned that. So we can just delete the second object that we have over here. And we are back with our first one. So once again, if we just want to view this one, we can press spacebar F and it's going to bring us back there. So over here on your left hand side, you can see that we have this camera selected. So when this camera is selected, you can move around by clicking with your left mouse button or your middle mouse button, or the ones that we learned before. But if you press S or you come to the selection icon over here, and you click on it, when you do the same thing now with your left mouse button, you are actually selecting things, so you can't move around. But if you are in this mode and you still want to move around, you can still do that if you press spacebar. So now we're pressing spacebar and you can see that it's coming back to this camera icon. So spacebar, and now we can tumble around again and use the movement controls like before. Okay, so over here we have essentially our selection options. So this is to select an entire object, so you can see the outline of an entire object. And then the next icon is to select certain things like points, edges, primitives, vertices. So now if you select that, you can select just the polygons, for example. So that's how you select either the whole object or just certain things or certain parts of one object. The next thing we are going to do is we are going to explore these few things. So these are your movement icon, where you can basically just move anything over here. But don't forget that most of your things you can just adjust over here. So you have your rotation, your scale, and your translate controls over here. And that is exactly the same thing as you have on this side. So then we have our rotation controls, our scale controls. This is just ragdoll. So that's, for example, for animation, when someone has a character and they get shot and they just fall down the stairs like a ragdoll. So that's for that. And then over here we have an interesting thing. It is the combination of all three of these. So you have your movement, your rotation, and your scale all in one. So you can choose whether or not you want to use that. I don't really use it, but you might find a use for it. Okay, and then you have your snaps, just like in any other software. It's good to know that they're there and they are very useful, but for the moment we're not going to use them. So we are going to jump back into our camera by just click on the camera and you are back inside of your movement options over here. So S key, it takes you into selection mode, and this camera, you are in your pan and movement modes. So as we move down, we are going to see that we have a animation timeline at the bottom over here. The most important things you need to know over here is just the basic play buttons and stop and the standard stuff. But over here, this real-time toggle is something that I think should be on by default. So this is essentially something that allows you to play back your animation in real time and not at full speed, because if this is not enabled, your animation will play at the fastest possible speed that the computer can manage. And if it is enabled, it will play it at 24 frames a second, or as close to 24 frames a second as the computer can calculate. The other stuff is just standard stuff like simple settings and sound settings. But for the moment, you don't need to know. The most important things you need to know as a beginner is just the basic settings here and this clock, because that's very important. Also, you can adjust your timeline length over here. So you just drop in 150 and then you have 150 frames. Over here is nothing too important. You can just sometimes, if your animation is continuously loading, you can disable auto update and click on manual. So, but that you'll learn once you start to do different kinds of simulations. Next thing we are going to come up to is these settings over here. The first one is just the grid, so you can just switch the grid on and off. And over here you have essentially, it shows you what viewport you are in. So at the moment we are inside of the perspective viewport, and to change viewports all you need to do is press 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if we press 1, that keeps us inside of our perspective viewport. If we press 2, it goes into the top view. If we press 3, front view, 4, right view, and 5, the UV view. So one thing I just want to point out is that if you go to, say for example, number 2, and you click it twice, it's going to go to the opposite view. So if you press 2, top, bottom, and that's pressing the same key, just pressing 2 twice. The same thing with number 3, so it's back, front, and that's just pressing the same key. So that's how you change your viewports, and if you're not sure in which viewport you are, just come over here and you'll know straight away. Another thing that you can do is you can work in a perspective viewport. So if we go and press 1, we are inside of our perspective viewport. I'm just going to press G one more time to center it. And if we wanted to work in, for example, the perspective view and a top view or a side view, left or right, doesn't matter. What you can do is you can press Ctrl 2. And that's going to divide your workspace into 2 separate viewports. And inside of this one, we have our perspective, and this one is our top. So when you're inside of this view, you can do exactly the same thing. You can press the same buttons, and that is going to set it into the viewport of your choice. So if we press Ctrl 3, it's going to give us 3, if it's 4, 4, and so on. So that's just something that's useful to know. We are going to just jump back to our standard 1 viewport for the moment. Okay, so another important thing to know is how to create a camera. So you just press Control and Camera, and that's going to create a camera from the perspective viewport. Okay. One thing that you need to realize, so when the lock is on, you'll be locked inside of your camera and you can move around inside of your camera. But if the lock is unlocked and you pay attention to this little spot over here, you're going to be outside of your camera. You are essentially inside of your perspective mode. We can do the same thing and create a light. So if we find the interesting spot, we have our camera over here and we want a backlight that's lighting this geometry, we can press Control and create a light. Okay, so that's how you create the camera and lights. And over here, if you come up over here, you have just a few different panels, your render view. This is where you're actually going to be rendering stuff if you're rendering it inside of Houdini. If not, you'll be exporting it here via a Limbic file, and you can render it inside of any other software. So at the moment it doesn't look really spectacular, but I can assure you that once we get into building proper projects, we will be creating some really awesome stuff. So here's just composite, motion effects, view, and geometry spreadsheets. For the moment, you don't need to worry about those things. We'll be learning them as we go along. One last thing is that when you're inside of selection view, once again by pressing S, and for example this, you just need to remember that inside of Houdini, Y is up, because in, for example, 3ds Max, Z is up. So it's just something to keep in mind. Over here we have the overview. Just press O to switch that off, and we are back over here. All right, guys, so that's more or less Houdini interface in a nutshell. Over here you just have a few shortcuts to simulations, but you don't need to know that for the moment. All right, guys, so there's just one last thing that we're going to go through, and this is this toolbar over here, and it's really quite simple. It's just essentially display options of how you can display different things inside of your viewport, and you can just play around with it. You don't even need to change anything. Default settings are more than enough, but you can just explore what you have over here. One thing that I would like to talk about is just that you can display the points, you can display the normals, you can display point trails. This is when you have actually velocity inside of your stuff, and display point numbers and these kind of things. But this will kind of come into play once we're doing different kinds of simulations and that kind of stuff. So you can just kind of click on these and just go through them. But as I said, the defaults are fine. And I think we've covered most of the things. Over here, you can just check out these options, but again, those are not critical. So feel free to go through the interface like I showed you, play around, drop a few nodes in, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Thanks guys, and have a good evening.